Save Britain's heritage at 50. Hello, I'm Richard Harwood, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And we're delighted to have with us Henrietta Billings, who is a director of Save Britain's Heritage. Hello, Henrietta.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's Save Britain's Heritage's 50th anniversary in 2025. Do you want to explain to us, first of all, who Save are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, Save is a national campaigning organisation. We're a charity and we cover the whole of the UK. We essentially campaign to stop the demolition of threatened historic buildings. But not only that, we campaign for their viable reuse. So that means working with architects, historians, and developers to come up with reuse proposals for these threatened buildings.
So how does Save come up with the rescue schemes for projects?
So we work with architects and engineers sometimes, depending on the perilous nature of the building and also what we're up against. So sometimes we challenge proposals for demolition. If the proposal, says that the building is unstable and can't be saved, we will bring in an independent surveyor to see if there is an alternative way of keeping the building. But we work with architects and developers to draw up visions, really, of how these buildings could look. And the idea of these visions, these architectural visions, is to really spark debate and get people talking about the potential. Because so often these buildings are written off as basket cases and not worth saving. And maybe they've been boarded up for years and maybe people have lost hope. But the idea of bringing in an architect with a really great rendering or CGI proposal to get people excited again about how these buildings could bring life back, often to city centres where they're standing.
One of the schemes which Save have been involved in recently is Grimsby. Do you want to take us through what's happened there?
This was a campaign that we worked on about 5 years ago, and we were brought in really at the request of the World Monuments Fund because they were really concerned about a street of buildings called Fishdock Road, which were at the heart of what's known locally as the Casbah, which is the centre of the old historic shipping and fishing port of Grimsby. And it's worth remembering that actually Grimsby at the end of the 19th century had the busiest fishing port in Britain. It was an extremely prosperous and busy place, very different to the feel that you get today in terms of the fishing industry. And these buildings had been empty for a very long time. And we challenged a proposal from the owners to completely knock down this whole side of one street to replace it with hard standing for storage. And the outcome of this, we had this very well publicised and very emotive campaign, actually, because a lot of people in Grimsby contacted us with stories about their families and friends who had worked on the docks and who felt really strongly that these buildings, which represented their history and the stories of their lives, were being lost and not being cared for. We mounted this campaign, and working with you, Richard, and Susan Ring, our solicitor, we challenged the basis on which the planning permission had been granted. Unfortunately, we didn't win, and those buildings were lost. However, the case attracted so much attention that we were really pleased when the council actually, on the back of our campaign, changed their strategy and that of the owners of the port. And what's really fantastic now is that the rest of those streets that make up what's known as the historic Casbah have been designated as a conservation area.
Yeah, so it gives a future to it. You mentioned I've been involved in a number of cases for Save over the last few years. Save have been involved with planning applications and some of the big public inquiries. And one of those, which I wasn't actually directly involved with, but a colleague in Chambers, Andrew Tabachnik, was, and I was a lawyer like David Cooper, was Smithfield Market in London. What was going on there and what was Save's approach to it?
Well, Smithfield has become such an iconic site and history for us, really, because we fought 2 public inquiries on that site over a period of about 10 years. Most recently was in 2015, and actually that was just before I joined Save. But it was a really fantastic fight, led at Save by Clem Cecil, who was the director then, and Marcus Binney, of course, who was our executive president. And that was a scheme which proposed the majority demolition of the General Market, which is the final building of a suite of 19th century market buildings, all covered. I think one of the most significant covered markets actually in Europe in terms of its procession of market buildings. And this particular end building, which had been owned by the Corporation of London and had been derelict for 30 years, was up for a super large office development, which would see essentially the buildings gutted, including this fantastic dome in the centre of the market with beautiful steel columns and really beautiful detailing. That was up for demolition, and SAVE fought a public inquiry. And as part of our team in that public inquiry, we worked with an architect called John Burrell from Burrell Foley Fisher Architects, and we came up with an alternative scheme. And that alternative scheme showed not only how this really beautiful 19th century domed market building could be repurposed as a public building, but we also showed for the first time the extent of the vast basements that really are almost like double height spaces underneath the General Market. And that was the first time we were able to visualize the potential of these spaces and what could happen instead of an office development, and how you could have a much more public use.
And ultimately went to inquiry. The Secretary of State at the time, Eric Pickles, I know personally took over the decision on that, and he agreed with the inspector that the scheme should be turned down. The inspector and the minister were both critical of the site having been allowed to deteriorate over the years. So that scheme having been rejected, what's now happening on Smithfield?
It's actually turned into a really great story, because the site now, it has been, as a result of a design competition that was held by the Corporation of London, the site's been acquired by the Museum of London, and it's going to be the new home of the Museum of London. This whole part of Farringdon and Clerkenwell is going to become a cultural hub, and with the new London Museum at its heart. So it's a huge transformation project. But what's really fantastic to see is this building is going to be not only reused and celebrated again as part of the history of market use. I mean, let's not forget, there's been a market on that site for 900 years, and it's been in public use. And this repurposing of Smithfield for the London Museum will see it again filled with people and telling the story of London. So it's a really fantastic place to be.
Quite often where we're dealing with buildings which need a rescue, they're buildings which are perhaps have, just thinking of the Country House example, gone through a situation of being in single, possibly quite grand family ownership, and then some form of institutional ownership in the 20th century. Perhaps individuals have taken over with the aim of restoring them, and that's all gone horribly wrong. They failed to do it. The building continues to deteriorate. The case of Wentworth Woodhouse comes to mind on that. How is it possible to sort of turn those sort of situations round? You want to particularly help us with what's going on at Wentworth Woodhouse and the nature of that building?
Yeah, Wentworth Woodhouse in Rotherham, South Yorkshire was really an incredible case, and it has an incredible history and story. The Fitzwilliam family behind it, and the coal mining history in itself is an extraordinary story. It's a building that has over 360 rooms and 2 different architectural treatments to its facades. It really is a fantastically magnificent and an impressive building. And it was in a touch and go situation 10 years ago because there was no viable long-term use. And the individual owner that had it most recently had done a terrific job in seeking to keep it together as much as they could. But a house of that size and proportion is just an enormous uphill struggle in itself. And so SAVE was instrumental in setting up the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust that went on to become a charitable organisation, which was then able to receive grants, including, and very critically, a £7 million grant from the government for stabilisation of the building. It then went on to be able to receive other really critical restoration grants from national institutions. And now it is run by a fantastic charity that looks after the building has managed to open up, with collaboration with other organisations like the National Trust, open up these magnificent rooms for the public, and you can get married there. You can have really fantastic house tours, and it's a restoration program that's ongoing, but they're really making fantastic progress. And it's also become a really important visitor attraction for the area. And I think the economic follow through effects, in a way, of having such a landmark visitor attraction has also been really considerable. So it's a fantastic story of revival and an economic growth, really. And it shows what these huge kind of powerhouses of heritage are capable of.
Yes, I mean, it's a remarkable story because it is a spectacular building. I think it's described as a calendar house, meant to be 365 rooms, 52 staircases and 12 entrances. I'm sorry, anybody actually got around to counting those, but I did have some involvement with that because I may have picked up that one of the issues which was actually going under the previous owner was whether quite a lot of the statues inside it, which are spectacular, and one or two of those are original Roman finds, and others are sort of 18th century Italian copies of Roman finds, whether they were part of the building. And that's picked up in some of the litigation, a case called Hayden Bailey. But I was advising the original family, the Fitzwilliam Family Trust, and some of those issues as people were working towards trying to find some solution for the site. So it is a spectacular building, but it becomes a matter of assembling those variety of interests and also presumably sufficient local interest and local involvement to take it on and do it.
And the local involvement has obviously been critical. As I understand it, there are lots of families and people associated with the house who work there and who've been involved for generations with that house, who have also taken part in being part of this whole restoration story, whether it's taking people around on tours or giving talks and volunteering. And having that kind of local enthusiasm and knowledge and kind of support has been really critical for the whole project's success, and wouldn't be anything without it, I think. And I'm sure Sarah McLeod, the director, will be the first to say that.
Obviously, something like Woodhouse, we're talking about a very grand, very big country house, grander than really than most palaces. But there's an awful lot of heritage around, a lot of which is more human scale. And one of the campaigns which SAVE have been involved with over quite a lot of the last 20 years has been about terraced housing and what the Labour government in the turn of the century was talking about, housing market renewal and the Pathfinder scheme. Do you want to take how SAVE sort of dealt with that project and how you were involved?
Yeah, sure. So the Pathfinder project really brought us to Liverpool, where we had one of our biggest campaigns for a very long time. And that was to save 400 terraced homes in Toxteth, just outside the centre of Liverpool, from mass demolition by Liverpool City Council. And this was just one of a number of areas in the north of England that were scheduled for demolition under the Pathfinder scheme. We got involved in Liverpool and helped the local community really not only fight for these homes and this entire neighbourhood, but also we uncovered a really interesting history about these buildings too. And it was also helped by the fact that this was where Ringo Starr was born and where he lived for some years with his extended family. And as part of our campaign, we ended up buying one of these houses that was scheduled as part of the demolition site. And it was number 21 Madron Street. And we bought it so that we could take part in the consultation for the compulsory purchase order and object to that and be part of the conversations about what was happening from an owner's point of view. We were also able to provide accommodation for a couple of young lawyers who ended up living in that house, who ended up getting very interested in housing policy and planning law, not probably by chance. But it was a really important campaign because we, as part of this campaign, not only did we do one of the houses up with help from many people, including Wayne Hemingway and his daughter, but we showed how these buildings didn't necessarily have to be consigned to the tip and what a waste it would be to demolish them. And in fact, what has happened, we won the public inquiry, and that was a ministerial decision against the advice of the inspector. We won the public inquiry, and then those buildings were acquired by a developer who has turned them into modern, adapted family homes. And the great thing is that this building type is so versatile. A lot of them have been knocked through 2 into 1 or 2 into 3 to make different types of housing sizes, so you can accommodate larger and smaller families. And you walk down those streets now, and they're bustling and full of life. They've replanted the trees, repointed the brickwork. It really is a fantastic sight to see. And they are also extremely popular. There are waiting lists to go and live in these houses. And it's a really good example of how the fortunes of an area can change and why these decisions about demolition that can be so immediate and long-term, things can change. And I think it's a really good example of what can happen in the long term.
And it says it's imaginative because a lot of the rationale behind the housing market renewal was the suggestion that there were large areas of pretty much identical terrace housing, predominantly in northern cities, which were not seen as attractive. They were seen as lower value than elsewhere, which itself shouldn't necessarily be a problem. Seen as rather sort of monotype, often 2 up, 2 down, or all the same sort of type. And so the government intention was to have them demolished and then have the private sector come in and build a new housing estate on those. And Liverpool Welsh Streets became a bit of a focus. I mean, the Ringo Starr connection, and we do love a good popular musician on the podcast. But I thought the timing of it worked out very convenient because, of course, 2010, we have the coalition government coming in, ministers who didn't like the project generally. And then in 2011, Liverpool City Council decided it was going to, having acquired a lot of the properties, going to demolish. And we had sort of a month or two before had the success in the Court of Appeal in the Lancaster case, the Sabin Heritage and Secretary of State in Lancaster, about whether or not demolition was subject to environmental impact assessment and so generally subject to planning control. And the Court of Appeal had said it was. And the result of that was that the ministers on Welsh Street said environmental impact assessment is needed to demolish these houses. You need proper planning application. So the council had come forward with a planning application as well as the CPO to acquire the saved property and those that followed it. So it was in the end quite a turnaround.
And what's great to see, I think, now is that it proves that that kind of attitude towards terraced housing is a pretty 20th century and old-fashioned one. And in fact, this building type is incredibly versatile and really popular. And also it's worth mentioning as well that the quality of these buildings in the Welsh Streets is really high. They were designed by an architect for the Welsh builders of the railway, which is why they're called the Welsh Streets. And all the streets have Welsh names. But you're talking about, in many cases, like 2-story bay window properties, which in lots of other cities would attract high prices and lots of interest. So the quality of these buildings was also really high. And we were really keen to also dispel this myth that terraced housing meant really poor quality of life and living conditions. Because of course, buildings like this with the right maintenance and upgrading and obviously making them suitable for 21st century living, they can really work extremely well and are very adaptable.
And one aspect of avoiding demolition and refurbishment in that debate is also now these days about climate change and the carbon generation involved in new build and the protection of the referred to as the embodied energy in the buildings which have been constructed. And one of those, probably the most high profile recent case of that is the Marks and Spencer's at Oxford Street in London. What's been going on there?
That was a really interesting case for us because it was really the first time that we'd got very much into the detail of the carbon and reuse argument, because we appointed Simon Sturgis, who's a leading authority and expert on sustainability and reuse of buildings. We commissioned him really early on in the Marks and Spencer's case to analyse the carbon impact of demolition and rebuild of the Marks and Spencer's building versus a comprehensive retrofit. And he showed that a comprehensive retrofit of that building would save an enormous amount of carbon, embodied carbon, which is all a really important component of the debate about net zero and how we reach it, because the construction industry alone is responsible for such a huge amount of embodied carbon emissions. So we ended up fighting this campaign, which really seemed to attract a lot of public interest. And of course, it's because it's Oxford Street. It's a very handsome, unlisted building right next door to Selfridges and one of Britain's favourite retailers involved. But it ended up being really the centre of the debate about retrofit and construction in Britain, and focusing the spotlight on what needs to change in terms of efficiency and making our existing buildings work much harder. Bearing in mind, of course, these buildings need adaptation and transformation, but do we really need to demolish them and build from scratch when we know what the carbon cost of steel and glass and building afresh, not to mention the design of the new building and all the other aspects of it? So it became a campaign that really seemed to catch the imagination of the press and the public. And we were very proud to lead that debate and to lead the public inquiry. And I think we have learned so much through that campaign. And it's really brought us a whole new area of expertise and knowledge, and also introduced us to a whole new audience of architects and engineers and sustainability experts. And I'm actually just really thrilled to be able to continue working with them, and as we focus on this sustainability aspect as a really major part of our work.
I mean, I think it's fair to say it's not just any public inquiry. And where it ended up was that the Secretary of State at the time, Michael Gove, refused planning permission, partly on the heritage grounds and partly on the loss of the embodied carbon. That decision was then quashed by the High Court, really on the basis that the minister had overstated what the policy was, that the policy wasn't as supportive of retention as he had suggested. And then towards the end of 2024, the new Secretary of State granted planning permission for Marks and Spencer. But I think a fair comment that the debate generally continues, and the government's policy approach is probably going to need to evolve in due course in some respect, but it's a very lively debate.
That's right. And immediately after the result of the M&S legal challenge, we issued a call to government to update the national planning policies you've mentioned. I mean, in a sense, that the reasons given by Gove that were successfully challenged by M&S show very clearly what's needed, which is an updating of the national policy. And in a sense, the wording of his decision almost gave us the words that we need to use for the updating, strengthening that policy around presumption of reuse over demolition. And we are working at the moment to seek a change and an update to that policy.
I just want to talk about one further example, which is one that's always in my mind twice a day as I walk from Waterloo railway station to Chambers, which is to walk through the Aldwych past King's College, London. And used to be lanes of traffic going in one direction, and now it's pedestrianised, which is probably going to help my life expectancy a bit. Can you take us through SAVE's involvement in what happened there?
There are 4 little buildings on the Strand, right opposite St Mary's Church, and right next door to the Court Hold. And these are 4 unlisted, quite handsome buildings that range from around the kind of mid to the late 19th century. And there are proposals from King's College to demolish these and build a very modern university building in their place. We were alerted by people working in the buildings nearby pretty late on, and we mounted a very quick campaign to try to persuade King's not to demolish these buildings, but instead to repurpose them. And over like a weekend, we got about 10,000 signatures to a petition calling for them to change their mind. And we also worked with an architect, John Burrell, again, to show how these buildings could be brought back to life. Again, hadn't been very well cared for. They were looking pretty grimy and grubby and a bit forlorn. But with a good architectural image showing ground floor, for example, cafe or student use, there's a whole variety of different ways you could liven up those street frontages. We showed how these buildings could actually add life and vitality back to this part of the Strand, and not forgetting that this is actually a really important road. It connects St Paul's to Trafalgar Square in the end. It's a proper processional route and lined with really important landmarks like the Court Hold leading on to Somerset House and so many eclectic and interesting buildings. And once you remove those buildings from history, from the history books, you lose something special. You lose part of that story of how this whole area developed. But anyway, working with this architect, we not only proposed the retention and adaptation modernisation of these 4 little houses, but we also proposed the pedestrianisation of this area of the Strand in front of the buildings. What is really great to see is, as a result of our campaign, not only were the buildings saved because Kings thankfully rethought their plans and withdrew the planning application.
The scheme was called in, wasn't it, by the minister?
It was going to be called in, yeah. And then Kings changed their mind and withdrew the application. But fantastically, Westminster City Council decided to progress a pedestrianised scheme for this whole part of the Strand. So now, as you say, you can walk down this part in the centre of the road, admiring the buildings and on all sides, including the wonderful church right in the middle of it. And what I love about it most is that you can actually hear yourself think. You don't have to take your life into your hands as you cross the road. And you could admire the buildings at the same time. It's one of those win-wins, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the great achievements in terms of public space in London in the last few decades, I think, probably since Covent Garden.
Yes.
Just touch on a few of the things that SAVE do. So SAVE have a buildings at risk register. How does that work and how do people get involved in that?
Yes, so we have a Buildings at Risk Register, which is, SAVE established this 30 years ago, and it's really a register of buildings in a whole different array of states of decrepitude and decay, really. You can nominate a building to be on this register, and the point of the register is that we monitor the state of these buildings. We talk to conservation area officers, we promote them to our supporters and to people in our networks as buildings that need new owners, new leases of life. And it's a way of really raising awareness about these different building types that are vulnerable and at risk. It's a register of listed and non-listed buildings. So it's different in that sense from the Historic England Register, which is only listed buildings. And of course, it's very representative of our work because it's not just very grand buildings. It could be beautiful Victorian corner shops. It could be farmhouses or rural buildings, which is a focus of our work at the moment. But it's buildings that are nominated by members of the public, by conservation officers, by anyone really who's worried about a building in their area and wants to bring some attention to it. We could also feature them on our website through the Buildings at Risk Building of the Month feature, where we highlight a building every month. But yeah, it's really a way of kind of publicising this whole range of buildings. And it's worth saying as well that SAVE works on all types of buildings and from buildings of all ages. So we're not constrained by one particular architectural period, for example, but we'll look at buildings from 21st century buildings as well as 16th century buildings. So it's a real array. And we've got 1,400 on there at the moment. And we have a nomination period every year where you can nominate buildings. And then we feature the top most at risk every year in a big press campaign.
How does SAVE fund itself and be able to run its campaigns and its work?
So we are completely independent. We're a charity that's obviously been running now since 1975. And we receive funds from a number of different sources, which is important so that we spread our risk as much as possible. But we have a Friend and Saviour subscription programme, so you can show your support for our work by taking out a yearly subscription, which is super helpful for us because we not only have a regular stream of income, but we also know we've got this band of people behind us who are supporting our work. And for the morale of the team, for the strength of the sector, it's really great to have Friends and Saviours. And then we also have trusts and foundations who very generously give us money on a 3 or 5 year basis, and individual donors who feel very strongly about what we do and have been supporting us for many years. So it's kind of like a range of sources. And then for our big campaigns, like for example, with Marks and Spencer's, where we crowdsource funded our legal fees for our barrister, Matthew Fraser, who did a fantastic job. But we crowdsourced all that from members of the public, which was also brilliant. So yeah, it's a real kind of mixture of funding, and all of it goes directly into our campaigns.
Now, it's the 50th anniversary of the founding of SAVE this year. What was SAVE doing to mark that?
We are doing a range of different activities focused on 4 national events, which are taking place in Norwich, Glasgow, Plymouth and Sheffield. And there we are collaborating with local community groups and local heritage organisations to talk about our work and support their work in repurposing and revitalising old buildings. We are also running a series of tours around the country. And this year we talked about Wentworth Woodhouse. We're running a tour of Wentworth Woodhouse, which we're really excited about, a 50th anniversary tour. And also we're doing a tour of Liverpool with JB, one of our very close collaborators who we work with on campaigns. He will be leading that tour for us in Liverpool. But the celebrations will culminate in November in a special lecture at the V&A. So we've got lots lined up and really excited to be celebrating this. The other thing to mention is that we've got a brand new website, which was long overdue. And we're really excited about kind of promoting that and getting as many people as possible to come and have a look at our work and see all of our campaigns on our website.
I think that's savebritain.heritage.org, isn't it?
That's correct.
Well, one final question. I mean, a lot of the political debate at the moment is about development, about housing need. It's about blockers, to use the Prime Minister's language. Where does heritage fit into this question of development?
I strongly believe that old buildings and heritage are and should be centre of this drive for new housing and the revitalisation of our high streets and our town centres. Because, of course, these buildings, as we've shown through these various different examples today, are inherently capable of reuse. And not only that, they keep the identity of places and the character of high streets and town centres, and they make places just more interesting. So instead of demolishing buildings and starting from scratch, these buildings have enormous potential for reuse. And recently, Historic England, the government's advisors on heritage, have published a really interesting report showing that vacant historic buildings across England are capable of accommodating 670,000 new homes. And when you think about that 1.5 million target, that's an enormous chunk of that target and would be an incredible way to help us get there. The other thing to mention is that a lot of the developers that we've been working with recently, particularly through the M&S campaign, where we made a lot of really interesting collaborations with enlightened developers who think a lot about historic buildings, was that they're finding, particularly the commercial side, that their tenants actually want to be in these buildings. They want to be in buildings with lighter environmental footprints, with higher ESG credentials. And in this whole kind of demand for encouraging your workers and your employees to come back into the office, but you want to bring them into offices that people want to work in. And this old idea of outmoded glass and steel boxes is increasingly unattractive, but people want to come to places which have a history, which have a sense of place and are interesting. And historic buildings just, they've got that in spades, haven't they?
A lot of the attraction of coming to a town centre is the character of the place, the ability to sit out there and enjoy the layers of history to it rather than it could just be anywhere.
Absolutely. And it's also worth saying that these buildings hold their value longer. So many of the buildings, the glass and steel buildings that we're putting up, will have a lifespan of 30, 50, 60 years, and then they'll come down again. But we can work with what we've got and modernise them and adapt them and make them thermally efficient. I think from an operational point of view, in terms of heating and utilities and everything, you can, with a comprehensive refurbishment scheme, you can reach almost the targets that you would with a new build. And we have the skills and the ingenuity here to achieve that. And the point is that in the longer term, you create places of greater value and the places that people really want to be in. And I think the heritage sector has so much of an important role to play in this debate about how we make places interesting and bring people back to town centres and revitalise high streets. And it's a pro-development, pro-vitality and revitalisation argument, and absolutely not a blocker argument.
Henrietta, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. We look forward to plenty more things that SAVE is involved with in the future, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.